Hello, welcome to Algebra 1 with Miss Andrea. Today we're going to continue learning about factoring in lesson 5.6. So this is module 5, which in the online book is listed as unit 3 and page 6 online. So that's why it is lesson 5.6. All right, so let me do a screen share here. Today's factoring we're going to get into is called difference of squares. So sometimes we have a polynomial. Remember, we're learning about special types of polynomials called quadratics. But our factoring has gotten into more than just quadratics because factoring is good for all kinds of polynomials. But they do help us when we get to solving quadratics. So we'll have a special type of polynomial, a binomial. What does binomial mean? Binomial means that there's going to be two terms. So let me pull up my pen here. A quadratic is usually a trinomial when you have things like 3x squared plus 7x minus 5. Okay, that's a trinomial. There's 1, 2, 3 terms. A binomial is something like x squared minus 12. There's 2 terms, 1, 2, binomial. This one was a trinomial, okay? So this is a binomial. This type of factoring is where there's a binomial, both the first and the second term are both perfect squares. And with this specific one, there has to be a minus sign in between, okay? So here's the rule, and we'll see how this works in the next few pages. But if the first term is something that is squared, and then you have a minus, and then the second term is something that is squared, then what you have is a plus b, or the first thing that was squared plus the second thing that was squared, but without the squares, just a and b within parentheses. And then that's being multiplied by a minus b. So again, the first term, the number that was squared, or the square root of whatever's there, and the square root of whatever the second term is, with a minus sign in the middle. So one thing you need to make sure to pay attention to is this only works with subtraction, and your answer will have 1 plus and 1 minus, okay? So it's not always letters. Like here we have a squared minus b squared is a plus b times a minus b. Well, that was easy enough. A lot of times you'll have numbers instead of letters, or even a letter with a number in front of it. So in this case, you have y squared minus 16. Well, the square root of y squared is y, and the square root of 16 is 4. And we have the minus sign right here. So this is y plus 4 times y minus 4. All right, called difference of squares. So it's pretty easy. So we're going to go ahead and start practicing some of this. We have x squared minus 64. Let's set this up. We know we're going to have 2 parentheses. We know one's going to have a plus and one's going to have a minus. What's the square root of x squared? Well, what times itself gives us x squared? X times x, right? X times x gives us x squared. So we can put x in the first spots of both of those parenthetical terms. And then 64 is 8 times 8. We don't need to pay attention to this negative sign here, okay? That negative is what's going to determine that we have different signs. 8 times 8 is 64. So we're going to put 1 here and 1 here. And we're done. So 8 plus x plus 8 times x minus 8. Now again, you could have also written that as x minus 8 times x plus 8, and that still would have been the correct answer. So let's look at this one. X squared plus 16. Well, we already know what the square root of x squared is. It's x times x. 16 is 4 times 4. But I have a plus here. So I actually cannot factor this at all because it doesn't have that minus. This is already a prime. It's a prime polynomial, okay? So here we have 49x squared minus 16. Well, 49 is 7 times 7. X squared is x times x. 16 is 4 times 4. We have the minus in the middle, so let's set this up. Instead of just putting the x in the beginning like I did before, I have to put a 7x. 7x. 7x, and my second term is going to be 4. All right, here I cannot find the square root of a negative number. Therefore, I cannot find the square root of negative 16. And what that means is we have to take out a greatest common factor, which in this case would be negative 1. Oh, actually, let's look at this. I can just rearrange this because I have a positive right here. Negative 16 plus x squared is the same thing as x squared minus 16. Think about it. If you had negative 2 plus 3, you would get a positive 1. What if you had a positive 3 and a negative 2? What would you get? A positive 1. So as long as the signs stick with the numbers, we can rearrange them. And we can go ahead and rearrange these terms so that it fits our purposes. And so in this case, we have our negative here in the center. Our x squared at the beginning is going to be x times x, and 16 is going to be 4 times 4. So it meets all of our terms, all of our requirements. And so we're going to have x plus 4 and x minus 4. All right, I believe I have all the answers typed up as well. X minus 4, x plus 4, 7x minus 4, 7x plus 4, x plus 8, x minus 8, and prime. All right. So there may be a time, I was jumping ahead of myself when I said we needed to factor out a greatest common factor. There may be a time when you have to do a greatest common factor first. Just like in the previous lessons, we learned that greatest common factor always comes first when you're doing factoring. So 2x cubed minus 32x. Let's think of something we can take out of all of those. I know that I can take a 2x out of both of those terms. So 2x cubed divided by 2x, all I'm going to be left with is x squared. Okay, my minus is going to stay there. 32x divided by 2x, 32 divided by 2 is 16, and the x is going to go away. So I already know what x squared minus 16 is. We just did that on the last one. So I'm going to remember that that's x plus 4, x minus 4. But if you didn't, x times x and 4 times 4. And because of that minus, we can complete the difference of squares. Okay, so this would be our final answer. All right, x to the 4th minus 16. So let's look at this. X to the 4th is x squared times x squared, and 16 is 4 times 4. So these are two perfect squares. It's just not one that we're really too familiar with, x to the 4th, but it is a perfect square, and we have a minus sign here in the middle. So we can go ahead and set up our answer here. And we're going to have x squared at the beginning of both of these, and we're going to have 4 at the end of both of these. So it looks like we're finished, but wait. This right here meets all the requirements for difference of squares, because x squared is x times x, and 4 is 2 times 2, and we have that minus sign right there. So we're going to break this down. We're going to factor it even more. This first one we can't do anything with, so we're just going to drop it down exactly as it is, x squared plus 4. Now the second one, we can go ahead and set up an equation. And we said that the first term was x, the second term was 2. So in this case, we factored it out into 3 separate multiplication or parenthetical terms. So x squared plus 4, x plus 2, and x minus 2. And this is our final answer. Three factors. Factor 1, factor 2, factor 3. All right, difference of squares here. This does not fit our requirements for difference of squares, our rules. We do have a square at the beginning. We do not have a square at the end, but we also have 3 terms. So there's got to be something else that we can do here before we get to difference of squares. Since our lesson's on difference of squares, it makes sense that that's going to be in there at some point. So let's look at this. We have a 1 as the A. So we can look at, okay, we need to multiply. This is a trinomial, so I'm going to look at maybe the first type of multiplying when A is 1. So we need to multiply and find something that equals 2, and we need to add to find something that equals -3. And I know that I'm going to have the same sign in both of them, and they're both going to be negative. So what multiplies to be 2? Well, that's easy. It's just 2 times 1, and they're both negative. -2 plus -1 is -3. So that's going to be easy. 1 and 2. Okay, well, what multiplies together? Since A is 1, I know there's not going to be a number in front of it, but if you notice, this is x to the 4th instead of x squared. So we can't just put a simple x here because that won't give us our correct answer when we multiply using the FOIL method. Our first times our first gives us our first term. Well, x times x gives us x squared, not x to the 4th. So in order to get x to the 4th, it's got to be x squared here. X squared times x squared is x to the 4th. Now, that's my first type of factoring that I did there. Now my lesson is on difference of squares. So that should trigger something in me to say, make sure to check to see if there's squares, if there's difference of squares here. They both have minus signs, so I'm on the right track. The first term is squared in both of them, x squared and x squared. Those are both perfect squares. 2 is not a perfect square. I can't find the square root of 2 and get a rational number. But 1, I can find the square root of 1 and get a rational number, right? 1 times 1, and this is x times x. So I can go ahead and make that one factor out a little bit more simplified. This, however, I cannot, so I'm just going to bring it down. X squared minus 2. And then this other one, I'm going to split up into 2 factors. So I'm going to have a plus and a minus because difference of squares, that's what we do. And I've got an x at the beginning and a 1 at the end. So my final answer is x squared minus 2 for term 1, x plus 1 for term 2, and x minus 1 for term 3. Now again, you can switch up the order of all 3 of those as long as what's inside the parentheses remains the same. Okay? All right, so it's your turn to practice now. Go ahead and pause the video and come back when you're ready to go over the answers. All right, let's get to it. Square root of x squared is x. Square root of 81 is 9. First thing I want to do is see if any of these are just, okay, this one I'm going to have to rearrange. But all the rest of these have minus signs in the center, so they look like they're going to be good. 9x squared, square root of 9 is 3. Square root of x squared is x. Plus and minus, square root of 25 is 5. This one I'm going to rearrange and say 8 minus 2x squared. Okay. But let's look at that. Okay. Before I can do difference of squares here, what I'm going to have to do is take out a 2. And I think what the answer key probably wants us to do, instead of rearranging that, is to factor out a -2. So I'll do it that way. If we factor out the -2 and leave x squared, that becomes a -4 there. And so we have our -2 on the side. I'm going to carry that over. And then I'm going to put my difference of squares parentheses right there, my plus and my minus, because I have a minus sign, and this is x times x, and 4 is 2 times 2. So x2 and x2. So that was the most complicated one on here because we did have some GCF with the negative there. So there you go. All right, let's move on. Here we also are going to have a GCF we have to factor out because this is x cubed. I can't find the square root of something that's cubed. So let me go ahead and pull out a common factor of x. I'm left with x squared minus 64. Okay, so there's going to be x, and then I'm going to have my difference of squares here on the end. And x squared, square root of that is x, and the square root of 64 is 8. All right, I see a common factor already here is going to be 3. X squared minus 1. And then x squared minus 1 meets all the criteria. So we've got our answer set up. Square root of x is, or x squared is x, and square root of 1 is 1. All right, this meets our criteria. Let's go ahead and set that up. Square root of x squared is x, square root of 16 is 4. And there's your answer. So that's difference of squares. I look forward to seeing you on the next lesson.